Good evening, everyone. Hi. My name is Nathan Marvin. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and I am pleased to welcome you all to the MacArthur Museum of Arkansas History. Now, before we get started, I'd like to thank Stephen McAteer, director of the museum, Len Johnson, our tech expert, thank you, as well as Simon Hawkins, coordinator of the Middle East Studies program at UA Little Rock, and all of my colleagues on the faculty, students, and all of our guests tonight. Thanks for being here. I'd also like to ask you to silence your cell phones, please, before we begin. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Terry Peterson, Associate Professor of History at Florida International University. Terry's research and teaching focus on modern Europe and European empires, with a particular emphasis on decolonization, migration, and warfare. His current project examines the nearly 70-year history of the Rivesaltes internment camp in southern France to understand why camps emerged as a key tool for modern states to manage human migration and why they remain so today. Terry's work has been supported by a Fulbright Fellowship and a National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Award. And before joining FIU, Terry held a postdoc fellowship at Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, and he continues to engage with professional military educators about counterinsurgency. In 2024, Terry received the Society for Military History's Van der Voort Prize for Outstanding Journal Article in the field of military history, and in 2025, his first book received honorable mention for the French Colonial Historical Society's Alf Andrew Hegoy Prize. That book, Revolutionary Warfare, How the Algerian War Made Modern Counterinsurgency, published by Cornell University Press in 2024, which we'll be hearing about tonight, focuses on the War of Algerian Independence, which for those of us who maybe aren't so familiar, was fought between 1954 and 62. It explores how French officers sought to counter demands for Algerian independence from France by transforming war into an exercise in armed social reform. Even social engineering, I think you say in one point, right? And so we'll see this story opens up important questions about the longer genealogies of such programs, ideas that many of you will recognize as preoccupations of the United States military as well. And I believe Terry will shed some light on those connections tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peterson. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marvin, and thank you to everyone for being here, and particularly to the Middle East Studies program, the History Department, the Center for Arkansas History and Culture in the MacArthur Museum for inviting me to come talk to you about my book, my favorite topic ever. My wife is tired of it, so I've got to find a new audience, right? Okay, that's northern Algeria. So in mid-May 1956, the new socialist government in France laid out a radical vision of French strategy in Algeria. The North African territory, which was home to 1 million European settlers and 10 million indigenous Algerians, was considered part and parcel of France rather than a colony, right? But it had plunged into a violent conflict with the emergence of a new nationalist organization, the National Liberation Front, or FLN, on All Saints' Day, 1954. Now, granted sweeping special powers, the government now turned to the army, not only as a weapon to crush the FLN, but as a tool to regenerate Algerian society, strengthen its ties to metropolitan France, and to win Algerians' enduring loyalty. France's enemies declared the new Prime Minister Guy Mollet must, quote, know the power of a strengthened French army, but this army would also bear profound reforms as a tool of goodwill alongside more conventional weaponry. Now, in many ways, this emphasis on winning Algerian hearts and minds marked an unprecedented shift, right? Little more than a decade earlier, in 1945, France had responded to popular nationalist uprisings in the Algerian cities of Sétif and Guelma with a series of swift and brutal repressions that killed an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 Algerians. Reforms promised in the aftermath had simply been ignored or boldly circumvented. What changes in the short period between 1945 and 1956, right? Why does the French army come to see its task not only as one of conventional combat or repression, but also of social reform. And how does it seek to embrace this new role? Now, in fact, as I began to dig my way through carton after carton of documents in French military and colonial archives, these questions only seem to multiply, right? Why did a campaign to quash anti-colonial revolution become an effort to rethink warfare itself, right? Why had modern warfare, writ large, been an exercise in development as often as it has been a combat exercise, right? And why has the Algerian War remained a key case study in modern counterinsurgency when French Algeria no longer appears on any map? Right? So the Algerian War raged from 1954 to 1962, and it played a pivotal role in the global process of decolonization. It redrew the human and geographic borders of the Mediterranean. It fatally undermined the legitimacy of French colonial rule. It rewrote the rules of international diplomacy and helped launch the Third Worldist movement for the liberation of the global South. But in many respects, the established narratives of the war itself remain oddly partitioned off from this global context, right? Historians have explored international mobilizations in favor of Algerian independence, but most continue to paint the actions of the French army in Algeria with a broad brush, right? As the last gasp of the same violence that shaped colonial rule from its start, or as the product of quote-unquote lost soldiers who, were driven to extremes by their long isolation in the colonies. And as a result, scholars have left the meaning and dynamics of much of the war's violence, particularly in rural areas, unanalyzed. The story of the French response to Algerian independence remains largely one of exceptionalism that reflects the claims of French officers themselves. Now, the story that began to emerge from archives and from these dozens of interviews that I conducted with historical actors in France and Algeria seem to stand in stark contrast to these narratives, right? French officers and colonial officials were not just reactionary defenders of the status quo, but sought instead to pursue their own project of radical social transformation that might preserve French Algeria against the global challenges of decolonization. Likewise, they didn't approach this project in isolation, but in dialogue with a range of foreign military partners grappling with similar issues. So in fact, as they drew together new systems of surveillance and repression with programs of armed social reform into a sort of coherent military doctrine, the French army looked abroad not only for inspiration, but to promote its own practices as a universal response to the social upheavals of the era. So as Dr. Marvin has highlighted, and as I argue in the book, French efforts to transform warfare into an exercise in social engineering not only shaped the Algerian War from its very start, but helped forge a paradigm of warfare that has dominated from the Cold War to the global war on terror that we call counterinsurgency. Okay, so to give you a sense of the book's arc and arguments, I want to explore the origins and development of the French Army strategy in Algeria, which they called pacification, right? Pacification is a euphemism, but it's not merely a euphemism. It was a set of practices and institutions that sought to dismantle Algerian social structures and rebuild them from the ground up in order to undercut support for the revolution and bind Algerians more closely to France. So first, I'm going to discuss the sort of broader context of colonial reform that framed the war and the way that civilian officials came to see the army as the ideal vehicle for social change, right? And second, I'll look at how this reformist project converged with a particular French understanding of the Cold War into a coherent operational doctrine by 1957. Then I'll zoom out to look at one of the ways that these pacification programs operated on the ground through a type of team called an itinerant medical social team. And finally, I'm going to touch on some of the reasons why the French war effort in Algeria proved so influential and the implications of the book for how we ought to think about modern counterinsurgency. Ultimately, pacification collapsed under the weight of its own violent contradictions. French officers' efforts to reimagine warfare, however, continue to reverberate today. Before we move on, I want to just make a quick note about sources. Please ignore how much younger I was in that photo when I was doing my doctoral research. Writing about the Algerian War can be difficult. It's still a very hot topic in France and Algeria. Many of the archives remain classified until very recently, and Algerians' voices are largely absent from the archival record anyways. Right? So I work to read the archives of the French military and the colonial administration against one another. They often disagree. And I also conducted dozens of oral interviews in France and Algeria to recover voices that were otherwise wholly absent from the documentary records of the state. So I'm happy to talk more about some of the ways that worked at the end of the talk. Okay, let's talk about colonial reform as a counter-revolution. And if you don't read French, I love this piece of propaganda from the French army. It says, in Algeria, France is remaking the French Revolution. So the Algerian Revolution materialized at a moment of really acute uncertainty about the future of the French Empire and France's place in the world. After the Second World War, an international order developed that emphasized human rights and national self-determination. And in fact, French leaders themselves contributed to its emergence. After 1946, they rechristened their empire as a French Union and set out to liberalize colonial rule. Right? And yet, the challenges to colonial rule from within and without the French Empire exploded in the decade that followed. In Algeria, even the most modest efforts at reform failed in the face of settler intransigence and governmental infighting. A demographic crisis and a weak Algerian economy only compounded a sense of government impotence. Algeria's legal, human, and fiscal foundations all seem to have cracked. Right? By the outbreak of the war, then, a significant number of civil and military leaders felt that their model of colonial rule had expired, right? Politically, socially, economically. They see this outmoded model of colonial rule, rather than any kind of nationalist challenge, as the motor driving Algerians to support the burgeoning revolution, right? So the era of colonization had passed, one administrator in Algeria recounted. It was necessary to create a new political framework where the Algerian could advance. Jacques Soustelle, the guy on the Time magazine, who became Governor General of Algeria in 1955, was just the guy to build that kind of framework. He's not your typical colonial official. He's a member of the French resistance. He's a close ally of Charles de Gaulle. But most importantly, he's an ethnologist. And he spent significant time working to promote indigenous peoples' rights during his fieldwork in Mexico. So from his earliest days in office, Soustelle calls France to admit the structural role racial discrimination had played within colonial society as the foundation for a counter-effort to promote the equality of Algerians. He laid out a broad slate of reforms aimed at harmonizing Algeria's legal code and economy with that of metropolitan France, right? By the way, when I say metropolitan France, for those of you who aren't familiar, I mean the hexagon, what we think of as France today in Europe. Right? And he laid out a sort of European integration style incorporation of those two territories that he really cleverly named integration, right? Now, rhetorically, this is not a radical shift. The French state had long justified colonialism as a civilizing mission aimed at uplifting colonized peoples under European tutelage. And the ostensibly progressive vision of empire Soustelle now articulated reasserted that vision. You can see here on some of these posters an example of that, right? You know, without renouncing their traditions, Algerian women will take part in the creation of a modern society. She's riding a bicycle with a water jug on her head, right? We've got this great poster, my favorite, on the right here, Algeria personified as a child, led by Charles de Gaulle. You can tell from the stars on his sleeve, up the stairs of time to, I guess, modernity, right? Where Soustelle differs from this civilizing mission is his insistence that the creation of a truly equal society in Algeria requires more than an extension of mere equality, right? After all, Algerians were technically citizens, full citizens, since 1947. In his view, it also requires a comprehensive effort to reduce social and economic disparities, and open access to education, employment, and social assistance, right? In Soustel's words, banning all discrimination to Algerians' detriment is not enough. We must not hesitate to establish discrimination to their advantage where necessary. What this means in practical terms is a project of intense state intervention aimed at land reform, economic modernization, education, social welfare, workforce development for Algerians. Right? In other words, the idea of integration drove French administrators to see liberalizing reforms, even if they had to be coerced, as an integral part of the war effort against the FLN. So from early in the war, Soustel and his peers already framed their response to the FLN as an effort to regenerate the colonial state rather than just to repress an insurgent enemy. The problem for Soustel is he doesn't have the power to carry out these reforms. Right? First, because the civil administration doesn't have boots on the ground, and second, because he faces this continued opposition of the powerful settler lobby who had long blocked any kind of reform. Right? So he has to find a workaround. Soustel aims to solve the first problem. He creates this special corps called the Special Administrative Sections. This is a corps of officers modeled on 19th century Arab bureaus. They exercise both civil and military powers in rural circumscriptions where the state didn't really have a presence, right? He sees them as the building blocks of a new administration, in his words, the beating heart of France in every douar, which is the basic administrative unit in Algeria. Now his successor, by the way, I love this photo of Robert Lacoste. They've just discovered oil in Hassi Massoud. He is so happy, right? You know. His successor, Robert Lacoste, solves the second problem. Within weeks of coming to office in 1956, he demands special powers from the French legislature to circumvent normal rule of law in Algeria and allow the French army to operate unencumbered, which legislators overwhelmingly grant. This very same law also allows Lacoste the ability to abolish Algeria's legislative bodies and ram all of Soustel's reforms through over the objections of settlers. Right? So he sets to work immediately, and following Soustel's lead, he looks not only to the CES, but to the army more broadly to begin implementing these reforms and, in his formulation, straightening out this shit show of an administration. Right? Now, historians often dismiss this recasting of France's civilizing mission as a modernizing mission as branding. Right? But it accomplished three subtle but important changes. The first is that it reframes Algerian difference not as cultural or racial, but as social and economic, and therefore mutable. Second, it transforms the colonial mission into a program of accelerated social reform. Right? French leaders now emphasize Algerian difference not as a means of exclusion, but as the basis for a project of intense intervention into Algerian society. And finally, it militarizes this program of reform by pushing it into the hands of the French army. And in fact, civil officials are only going to reinforce this by pushing more and more of these programs into the hands of military leaders throughout the war. And military leaders really come to see modernization as their own special mission in Algeria. Okay, so we've got all these reforms. How does that become a model for fighting warfare? This is a map, by the way, there's hundreds of these in the French archives, that sort of trace the state of pacification in a certain circumscription, right? So the green areas were good, population seems to like us, the red areas were bad, they don't. Now, this reformist impulse is not the only strand of strategic thinking that's shaping the French war effort. By 1957, it begins to converge with two other theories of war in places like the High War College in Paris and in policy institutes and military intellectual circles on both sides of the Mediterranean. The first is a nascent theory of revolutionary warfare, right? You can see up there it says guerre révolutionnaire et armes psychologiques. The idea that the threat of atomic warfare had transformed war into a subversive struggle for the control of populations rather than the control of territories, right? This is an idea largely articulated by field officers who had fought in World War II and in Indochina and other colonial war zones like Madagascar, and who now return to Paris to take up research positions in military academies, right? Many of them have spent time in Viet Minh re-education camps, and so they are very well versed in Maoist revolutionary theory, right? So for theorists like General Lionel Max Chassin or Colonel Charles Lacroix, who you see up there on the screen, the war in Algeria is not a revolution, but part of the global war waged by communists using subversive strategies developed by Mao and refined by the Viet Minh. And the aim of this form of warfare is to turn the population of a territory against the established government using propaganda and clandestine coercive organizations that can mobilize civilians. Right? In essence, these officers are trying to theorize a response to anti-colonial liberation struggles in the global south in terms that can sort of explain away the popular support for these struggles. Now, the second set of ideas these thinkers draw on was an emergent discipline of psychological warfare that really exploded in the wake of World War II. Right? Allied militaries are super fascinated by the apparently scientific abilities of the Nazis and the Soviet Union to manipulate the human psyche through mass media. Right? And one of the big discussions alongside nuclear weapons that NATO allies are having at the time is how to build new capacities for this form of psychological warfare that they think is going to define this era. And partly because of that effort, you have by the mid-1950s a brand new corps of officers within the French military who draw on pop psychologies of Jung and Pavlov or workplace management theories to argue that they can condition certain behaviors, even reflexes of loyalty, through images and slogans. Spoiler alert, they cannot. Right. Now, all three of these strands converge, right? Reformism, revolutionary warfare, psychological warfare. They all converge in the spring of 1957 in an important pilot operation, cleverly named Pilot Operation, right? Opération Pilote in French. Now, when we think about French strategy during the Algerian War, the image that immediately comes to mind is the Battle of Algiers. How many people have seen the Battle of Algiers, that famous film? A fair number, okay. And, you know, it's true that the Battle of Algiers plays a key role shaping French intelligence practices and urban operations. Right? But 1957 is this moment of intense experimentation within the French army. And arguably, Operation Pilote played an important, as important, if not more important of a role in shaping the French army's rural operations, which are the vast majority of the war. Now, Pilote is spearheaded by these two guys on the left, Colonel Michel Gousseau, who's the head of the Psychological Warfare Bureau in Algiers. He's known for having these like piercing blue eyes and for being like a dyed-in-the-wool anti-communist. And this ethnographer that you see by the Jeep, Jean Servier, who's your sort of classic academic grifter hoping to make it big in defense policy circles, right? None of us know anybody like that. And the idea behind Operation Pilote is to develop a multi-stage operational strategy that could not only root out and destroy the FLN, but actually replace it with a sort of semi-clandestine grassroots political infrastructure that was pro-French. So here, Gousseau and Servier set out to appropriate what they see as the methods of their adversaries by setting up programs that target distinct social groups for mobilization, right? I mentioned the Maoist thing. This is where they're drawing on Maoist theories of revolutionary war, right? They create self-defense militias for men, medical and social services for women, sports groups for children, and they sought to replace the traditional village council, which is known as the Jama, entirely with pro-French agents that would be recruited locally and trained sort of in secret by the Psychological Warfare Bureau. What Gousseau and Servier hope is that this grassroots infrastructure can immunize Algerian society against subversion, and they also hoped it would serve as the tool for this modernization to transform Algeria along French lines as part of this project articulated by Soustelle. Now, it's important to note that this effort did not replace the forms of repressive violence such as torture or forced resettlement that characterized the war. right? Instead, it served to complement them. The French command argued that they had a dual mandate, a sort of dialectical, right, to destroy Algerian social structures that had been commandeered by the FLN and construct a new Algeria, an Algérie nouvelle, tied even closer to France. Right? You can see up there at the very top, it says détruire, construire, destroy, construct. Right? And what Pilot and its follow-up operations allowed them to do is to fashion all the various practices that they tested out in 1957 into a single operational doctrine that became the basis for French strategy through the end of the war. So all the insights from the Battle of Algiers, the stuff from Pilote, the youth sports groups, which come from another operation around the city of Constantine, all of this becomes the multi-step doctrine of pacification that really focuses as much on mobilizing civilians as on combating an insurgent enemy. This is the model that the army then sets out to spread across Algeria. It's also the model the French army begins to proselytize in 1957, before Pilote is finished, to their allies, right? Through a series of individual and group visits to active war zones, through the Supreme Headquarters, the Allied Powers of Europe, right? This is a booklet that they disseminated to other militaries at SHAPE, and later through military advisors who went to other militaries to train them. Okay, that's all a bunch of theory. So what do these look like on the ground, these programs, these pacification programs? The French army fashions a whole set of practices and institutions as they're sort of struggling to assert this vision of armed social reform. But I want to zoom in on just one to really give you a sense of the general thrust of the Army's action and the complicated social relations it produced on the ground. So I'm going to look at one called the Équipe médico-sociale itinérante, the itinerant medical social teams. Right? So Servier and Gousseau create these teams, which I'll call the MC for short, right, to target rural women. They're made up of European and Algerian women who are recruited as social workers. They circulate the countryside offering medical advice, instruction in hygiene, infant care, basic nutrition, all of this aimed at making the bodies of Algerians cleaner, healthier, and more orderly. Right? During their weekly visits, the MC focus on managing the intimate habits of daily life, bathing children, instructing mothers how to properly swaddle babies, checking to see if homes are properly cleaned. They also host communal gatherings like this one for women in order to teach French, household economics, civics lessons. These meetings allow them to collect intelligence and disseminate propaganda. But just as importantly, they see it as an opportunity to teach Algerians the Western attitudes and comportments that they need to participate in the industrialized consumer society they hope to create in Algeria. Right? The ultimate goal of sorts for the MC is to pass it off to Algerian women themselves so that they can run the program. Now, this focus on social work stems from the fact that French officers read support for the FLN's guerrilla war through a gendered lens of social disorder. Right? French observers interpret the Muslim veil as a sign of the same domineering excessive masculinity that they blame for leaving Algerian men vulnerable to the temptations of armed rebellion. Right? And likewise, they see in the idle, out-of-work bodies of young men not the effects of endemic poverty or rural unemployment, but a sort of learned cultural laziness rooted in the moral underdevelopment of an agrarian society. French officers reason if they can rebuild Algerian societies around the model of the French nuclear family, rather than the sort of extended kinship structures that typify Algeria, they can restore social order and encourage a rapprochement between Algerians, settlers, and metropolitan France. Now, because they were meant to be part of a propaganda measure, the MC's visits were highly choreographed affairs, right? The MC often worked alongside propaganda shock teams or arrived right in the wake of search and sweep operations, right? So this visit of the MC to the village of Beni Choumeran on June 30th, 1957 was really typical, right? The MC arrived in the morning, they parked their trucks in the shade of these two enormous oak trees, then aided by a regiment of paratroopers, they worked in an assembly line to bathe all the village's children in galvanized basins, shaved their heads to fight lice, administered vaccines, And finally, they return the children to their parents, adorned in crisp white linens. Servier, Jean Servier, visits this operation in his little helicopter. He flies in, and he celebrates it as worthy of the Jordan, a baptism by immersion in the French Republic. Right? Very. But it's worth dwelling for a moment on the more complicated picture portrayed by the photos of the event that weren't published. Right? These were taken by a propaganda photographer, never published, and many of the photos depict a much more ambiguous scene. People seem uneasy or maybe bored. It's kind of hard to sense. Children seem terrified, uniformly terrified across all these photos. There are these leering soldiers posing with kids, hanging out as kids are stripped publicly and roughly handled by the team's personnel. It's worth noting that the visits of the MC were often much more overtly coercive, right? In towns like Qadiria and many others, military commanders report that they assembled residents by force at gunpoint, and the MC often predicated any aid they provided on compliance with the hygiene and parenting instructions that they handed out. Families who failed to measure up were simply left out of distributions of semolina, winter clothes, etc. Sometimes the advice doesn't fit very well, right? The MC themselves complain that they're like telling women how to wash clothes and there's no access to water in the village. So there was a fundamental disconnect in French perceptions of how these programs operated on the one hand, and Algerians' experiences of them on the other. And this disconnect means that programs like the MC never operated in the straightforward way that French officers believed that they would. Oops, I've got to go back to this one. Here we go. From 1958 to early 1961, Algerians did engage with these programs in really large numbers. French officers read this engagement as a straightforward indicator that their efforts to mobilize Algerians were succeeding. And in fact, Algerians' relative willingness to engage with these programs, compared to more overtly political efforts, helped drive the rapid expansion of these and other forms of social work. Right? In the archives, we can see the Army's social programs sometimes generated amicable relationships between Army personnel and the communities they targeted, but importantly, this happened only mid-war and largely only because of the Algerian personnel recruited to the various teams, right, who often failed to do the propaganda part of their work. Most often, Algerians engaged the Army's social programs in strategic and deliberately ambiguous ways, right? They use the services they needed, whether medical care or food aid, and they ignore the other aspects of the programs like propaganda, right? One of the best stories I was told, and I found a complaint from a French officer in the archives that corroborated it, is that in meetings like these in the town of Ain Tamushin, the women would show up because they were expected to, and they would just talk. They would talk without stopping as loud as they could, and the propaganda officer couldn't get a word in edgewise, right? It's a great model of passive resistance. The coercive nature of the Army's pacification apparatus meant that many Algerians had no choice but to engage with Army services, whether to meet basic needs, escape a degree of surveillance, or because many Algerians were in fact detained behind the barbed wire fences of resettlement camps, right? 2 out of 10 million Algerians passed through these resettlement camps during the course of the war, right? And so faced with all these constraints, many rural inhabitants adopt attitudes of deliberate inscrutability or confused disinterest, right? These drive military officers crazy, but they also play to French stereotypes about Algerians, and so they allow Algerians to escape any repercussions for refusing to cooperate. Now, eventually, this passive accommodation breaks down, and I apologize, this map's mostly in French, but I've tried to give you a key there. In December 1960, Algerians pour into the streets of major cities to vehemently reject French rule. Many of these protesters hail from the very same demographics and indeed from the very same communities that the Army targets for pacification, in large part because the programs themselves alienate Algerians. Right? Algerians chafed at the violence and immiseration imposed on them by the war effort. They chafe at the humiliation and terror that they suffered regularly at the hands of Army personnel, whether armed troops or social action teams. And on a very basic level, French officers fundamentally misunderstood the society that they sought to change, and Algerians suffered as a result. When I was driving around rural Algeria with my fixer, Farid, I mentioned that I had some documents from the CES that was based in his town, and he said, "What is that? What is the CES? Explain to me." Right? And so I started recounting, and he started laughing in the car. I was like, "What's so funny? This is the friendly face of the French administration, right? The CES." He said, "When I was a bad little boy, my grandmother would say to me, 'You better be good, or the CES will disappear you in the night.'" Right? That's the disconnect between the two. So pacification doesn't simply fall short of achieving its objectives. Rather, the violence and the coercion of the strategy, as much as political developments in Algiers or Paris, help drive Algerians to embrace independence. Okay, let's talk about the legacy and implications. I know maybe this is all French to you, right? So it's a very bad pun. My students hate that. So let's recap a little bit, right? So confronted with the spiraling war of national liberation, French civil and military leaders launched this radical project to transform Algerian society from the ground up, right? To accomplish this transformation, they fashioned new forms of surveillance and social control that focused on mobilizing civilians, and this imagined process of social reordering failed. Right? It profoundly misread Algerian society and in fact helped to drive Algerians to throw off the yoke of French rule. So why then have French doctrines and practices proven so enduringly influential on modern counterinsurgencies? One reason is the timing and the context. Right? The Algerian War occurs at this sort of precipitous moment when the British, US, and other militaries are all attempting to develop new quote-unquote unconventional strategies for waging war in places like Korea, Malaya, Indochina, Kenya, eventually Vietnam, right? These efforts evolved in conversation, and French officers bore an important imprint on the ontology, right? The idea of the nature of the Cold War enemy in the global South, precisely because they captured the zeitgeist of this moment and condense it into a detailed, systematic, and easily portable set of doctrines that they share with everybody else. The more pressing reason, however, is that French officers intentionally seek to capture this influence. Right? Through both official and unofficial channels, French officers promote the doctrines and practices formulated in Algeria as universal solutions to the revolutionary upheavals of their era. So officially, they bring dozens of foreign officers from Britain, the US, Argentina, Belgium, Brazil, Iran, Israel, Spain, Portugal, and other countries on operational training visits to Algeria itself, right? Beginning in 1957 with Operation Pilote before it's even finished. They also send advisory training missions to the general staff or military academies of many of those same countries after the war had ended. And then unofficially, officers whose active duty careers ended with the Algerian War also set out to gain a foothold in the policy world, right? And here, the guy in the center, Lieutenant Colonel Roger Trinquier, comes to mind, right? His book, Modern Warfare, remains a standard text on the topic. So too does the guy with the glasses on the right, Captain David Galula, whose thinking actually bore no imprint whatsoever on French strategy during the war, but who found an eager audience afterwards within US defense circles on the cusp of the Vietnam War. Galula actually spent much of his career before this as a liaison officer in the French army working directly with the American military. So he knows his audience, and it's hardly surprising that the other figure up here, General David Petraeus of the US Army, rediscovers Galula and grabs onto his narrative of the Algerian War. Right? He resurrects Galula from obscurity in the early 2000s and draws heavily on his ideas to develop his own strategy for Iraq. In fact, many of the myths and omissions that continue to define the stories we tell about the Algerian War today are products of the stories spun by French officers themselves as they sought to market their ideas to military audiences abroad. Right, so where does that leave us? What implications does the book have for how we think about the Algerian War or for modern warfare writ large? Right, I think the first, for the historians in the room, is fairly obvious. We need to rethink well-worn narratives of the French army amidst the Algerian War, right? Armed social reform is not just a supplement to the main action of repression, but shaped the French war effort from the start. And we can't really understand the dynamics of the war or the conflict's evolution without telling stories of these programs and the Algerians they targeted. right? More profoundly, however, I think we need to move past an understanding of counterinsurgency as a universal trans-historical category of war that looked the same across time and space, right? We have to reapproach these well-worn narratives of counterinsurgency more critically, read texts by the counterinsurgency theorists of the era much more skeptically, and we need to do the actual hard work of archival research and oral history to reconstruct the lived reality of the past. Counterinsurgency, as we understand it today, is the product of a particular historically contingent moment, right? And it's only in historicizing that form of warfare that we can begin to reassess some of the core assumptions that continue to shape our understanding of it, right? The ideas about human psychology or cultural tutelage or vast Maoist global conspiracies that undergird French thinking in the era feel like wildly misguided or even kind of like a little laughable today, right? And yet the notion that counterinsurgents can somehow structurally adjust society to the point that insurgencies become untenable persists in military doctrine. The effort to find a more humane form of war is in many ways quite old, and it affects its own kind of epistemic violence, right? The project to remake Algerian society was really at its heart a project to erase Algerian society as it existed. And we need to recognize that this imperative still drives much of counterinsurgent thinking. One sort of final thought, right, is that the story of pacification is ultimately a Franco-Algerian story. We often frame it as a Franco-French story, right? And as good as historians or political scientists often are at understanding counterinsurgents and insurgents, I think we leave the civilian people who endure this form of social warfare out of the story at our own peril, right? If counterinsurgency is a war through and on civilians, then we can't truly understand it until we see them as more than a human terrain, but as actors in the war in their own right. And so in this sense, French officers proved ironically prescient. By making Algerians themselves into the focus of a brutal 8-year war effort, the French army helped ensure that Algerians themselves would decide its outcome. Thank you very much.